The transatlantic slave trade, one of history's most brutal and inhumane institutions, was largely driven by European powers from the 16th to the 19th century. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas under horrific conditions to serve as slaves in plantations and industries. While European demand, navigation, and military power were the primary engines of the trade, many African rulers and merchants played significant roles, engaging as intermediaries who facilitated the capture, sale, and transport of their fellow Africans. Moreover, what is also important to note is that slavery was commonplace across Africa long before the transatlantic slave trade began in the 16th century. And sadly, slavery is still present in Africa to this day. So when Europeans began looking for slave labor for their plantations in the New World, they simply tapped into many of the pre-existing local African slave systems present at the time. The most prominent African kingdoms engaged in slavery during that time included the Oyo Empire, Nigeria, Kingdom Empire, Burkina Faso, Kingdom of Koya, Sierra Leone, and Ashanti Empire, Ghana.
I wish to apologize deeply on behalf of the chiefs and people of Gold Coast and Ghana for the atrocities, the inhuman treatment that were committed 400 years ago by my ancestors during the Atlantic slave trade.
However, the most notorious was the Kingdom of Dahomey, located in present-day Benin. For over 2 centuries, from the 17th to the 19th centuries, the rulers of Dahomey actively engaged in the capture and sale of enslaved Africans to European traders. This involvement allowed the kingdom to accumulate wealth and power, but it also had profound consequences for Dahomey and the broader region. Understanding Dahomey's role in the slave trade sheds light on the complexities of African participation in this brutal system and the internal dynamics that drove the kingdom's engagement. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, share your thoughts below in the comments. Your support means a lot to us. Now let's get on with the video. The Kingdom of Dahomey was established in the early 17th century when its founder, King Haugbaja, consolidated power over the Fon people and established the capital at Abomey. His successors expanded the kingdom through military conquest, subjugating neighboring states and absorbing their territories. By the time of King Agaja's reign, 1708 to 1740, Dahomey had grown into a powerful military state. Agaja's leadership was instrumental in shaping Dahomey's involvement in the slave trade. He expanded the kingdom's influence along the coast, conquering the port city of Ouidah in 1727, a key center for the Atlantic slave trade. This acquisition allowed Dahomey direct access to European traders and the lucrative slave markets. Dahomey's participation in the transatlantic slave trade was closely linked to its military expansion. The kingdom maintained a highly organized and disciplined army, which played a central role in its economic system. Dahomey's rulers frequently launched raids and military campaigns against neighboring peoples, capturing thousands of prisoners who were sold into slavery. The kingdom's economy came to depend on the profits from the sale of enslaved individuals to European traders, particularly the Portuguese, Dutch, and British. The Dahomey army was renowned for its elite court of female soldiers, known as the Amazons or Agoji. These female warriors were integral to the kingdom's military might, participating in slave raids and defending the kingdom from external threats. These warriors epitomize the strong black women we have in our society today. The captured individuals were marched to the coast, where they were sold to European slavers, who transported them across the Atlantic to the Americas. These captives endured horrific conditions during the Middle Passage, with many dying before reaching their destinations. Dahomey's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was driven by economic incentives. European traders offered a variety of goods in exchange for enslaved Africans, including firearms, gunpowder, alcohol, textiles, and other luxury items. The firearms acquired through the trade strengthened Dahomey's military power, allowing the kingdom to conduct further raids and expand its territory. The kingdom's rulers benefited immensely from the wealth generated by the trade. They built lavish palaces, acquired valuable goods, and bolstered their political and military dominance. The rulers of Dahomey also imposed taxes and levies on slave markets and trading activities, further enriching the kingdom's coffers. This accumulation of wealth, however, came at a great cost to their fellow African people, as entire communities were decimated, and the social fabric of the region was severely disrupted. The slave trade was not only an economic enterprise for Dahomey, it also had cultural and ritual significance. The kingdom's rulers engaged in elaborate ceremonies and rituals that reflected their power and control over the slave trade. One of the most infamous practices was the annual customs festival, which included the sacrifice of prisoners of war to honor the spirits of the ancestors and the gods. These rituals were intended to ensure the prosperity and stability of the kingdom. While most prisoners were sold to European traders, some were retained for these ceremonies or as domestic slaves within Dahomey. The kingdom's leaders viewed the slave trade as a necessary and acceptable part of their political and spiritual world. King Gizo, who ruled Dahomey from 1818 to 1858, famously declared, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth." Under Gizo's rule, Dahomey intensified its involvement in the trade, conducting even more slave raids to meet European demand. By the 19th century, European powers, particularly the British, began to push for the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. This pressure created tensions between Dahomey and European traders, as the kingdom's economy was so dependent on the trade. King Gizo initially resisted efforts to end the slave trade, but in the 1850s, he agreed to a series of treaties with the British, promising to reduce Dahomey's participation in the trade. However, the kingdom continued to engage in the sale of slaves on a smaller scale for several more decades, therefore ignoring those treaties. The end of the transatlantic slave trade marked the beginning of Dahomey's decline. Without the wealth generated by the slave trade, the kingdom's power waned, and it faced increased pressure from European colonizers. In 1892, Dahomey was defeated by the French, who annexed the kingdom and made it part of French West Africa. Today, the Kingdom of Dahomey falls within the small West African nation Benin. Unlike some African countries, Benin has publicly acknowledged, in broad terms, its role in the slave trade. In 1992, the country held an international conference sponsored by UNESCO that looked at where and how slaves were sold. In 1999, President Matthew Karakou visited a Baltimore church and fell to his knees during an apology to African Americans for Africa's role in the slave trade.